you're not going to be able to stand before God. And that's what the Hebrew author is trying to get us to see. Verse 32, after making this comment, he tries to encourage us so that we won't make that mistake. Here's what he says in verse 32. Think back on those early days when you first learned about Christ. Remember how you remained faithful, even though you met with terrible suffering. And he's going to go on with this idea for a minute, but doesn't this make you think of Jesus' letter to the church at the church at where? Ephesus. Remember what he told them to do?
Remember their first love.
Remember your first love. What's the Hebrew author trying to get us to do here to try to keep us on the right track? Think back on those times. Do you have mountaintop experiences in your spiritual life? Do you have those times when, wow, I was really doing good with God? Do you have those events in your life? You know what the Hebrew author says? Cherish those. Think back on them and think, what was I doing? What motivated me then? How did I get off track? I need to get back to being that kind of person. Well, notice his example of what he considers a mountaintop experience. Okay? What does he consider a mountaintop experience? He says, you remain faithful even though it meant terrible suffering. Does your translation say suffering?
Face of suffering.
You know what the Greek word is? I only throw this out because I hope you recognize it. Athlesis. It's the word from which we get athletics. And the idea is physical exertion. When you really put it out there. He said you really physically had to give it your all because things were really bad. Verse 33, he says sometimes you were exposed to public ridicule. The word for public here literally means in the theater. Wow. Okay. I don't think he's talking about the people who were thrown in the theater, although he could have been. You remember what happened in the Roman times when the Christians were thrown into the theater? And then the wild animals were released. Before they released the wild animals, Nero had the habit of covering the Christians with animal skins. He wanted to make it more entertaining, I guess. I don't know. But he covered them with animal skins and all the smells and everything. Then he turned loose the wild animals that they purposely hadn't fed in a while so that there would... all that stuff. Could be a reference to that. Probably not. The word means in the theater, but the idea was not just persecution in the theater, but a public display. It just means everybody could see it, right? He says you were exposed to public ridicule, you were beaten. Sometimes you helped others who were suffering the same things. Now, I hope that there's always this closeness with God's people. What does it say at 1 Corinthians, the 12th chapter? When one of us rejoices, when one suffers, yeah, which, by the way, can I just tell you my personal opinion here? I think we have a harder time rejoicing with those who rejoice. It's just an observation, and maybe it's because the people I talk to, I don't know, limited perspective. But too many times I talk to people when, somebody, I don't know, they get a new car, things go well. One of the first things that comes out of people's mouths, you know what it is? It's not, man, I'm so happy for them. It's, why can't I get a new car? That's always, yeah, that's the way to rejoice with people. Stop that! Okay, and we've got to stop doing that. But 1 Corinthians 12 also says that we suffer with those who suffer. Okay, there's an added dimension to this in the first century. Can you think of what it would be? What kind of suffering did people go through in the first century? I know there's a lot, but think of the extreme suffering.
Terrible. I mean, like you just said, you gave an example where animals eating them. And people setting them on fire.
Yeah. Oh boy, there was all sorts of persecution in the Roman Empire. That's exactly right. But before the sentence was carried out, where would these people be kept? In the dungeons or prisons. In the prisons of the first century, what do you know about those?
Very same.
How well were they funded? What was the cafeteria like?
Whatever they brought you.
That's right. Lord.
And who brought you?
The relatives.
Yeah, if you didn't have somebody on the outside, you were in real trouble. So there's an added dimension to this because confiscation of property and stuff and people thrown in prison, if there's not somebody on the outside taking care of you. I remember when one of the trips we took to Venezuela for a missions trip, we went by to visit somebody in the hospital, and it's not this bad, but they said it's close. But if you didn't have family members to take care of you, the nurses wouldn't take care of you
At the hospital?
at the hospital.
Wow.
We're talking Venezuela, which I know some people think romantically when they think of Venezuela, but there's, ooh.
So why do you go to a hospital?
Not because you want to. Yeah. Be pretty bad, but you need some family members there. You need some help. And it's one of the areas where, if I understand this correctly, the mission really, you know, it makes me think in the first century, one of the things that Christians made the reputation doing was taking the children who had been abandoned on the garbage heaps, looking after the orphans because they were discarded. In the Roman Empire, you didn't even have to name your child till he was, you know, adolescent, because it was totally up to the father whether he wanted to keep him or not. Well, in Venezuela, they were able to have an impact. Their mission was because they would go into the hospitals and help some of these people that nobody else would help. Because the hospital, you know, the government's really taken things over. I'm getting so far afield, but it just makes me think, people who think communism is such a wonderful thing, all they need to do is visit someplace that practices stuff like this. And you'll see what a terrible idea it is, because this, okay, let's get back to the book of Hebrews. Sorry. Helping out those who are suffering the same things is something that Christians have done throughout the years, and missionaries are doing today, and it's a powerful thing. And he says, you know what? You did that kind of stuff. Now notice what he's talking about here. He says, remember back on those days. He doesn't say, remember back on those days when you had it easy and God answered all your prayers and life was good. No, he's asking us to remember when we had the spiritual successes, which usually is associated with really tough times. It was hardship and you pulled through. There was something terrible and you helped somebody else pull through because you were the guy there giving them the encouragement and helping them in their time of need. And you know what? That's one of the things that ought to motivate us. He says, you remember that stuff. Verse 34, you suffered along with those who were thrown into jail. And when all you owned was taken from you, what'd you do?
Joy.
Accepted it begrudgingly.
No.
How do you explain that? Okay, before you answer that, answer this one for me. How do you explain that the apostles, when they were beaten by the Sanhedrin for preaching about Jesus, how do you explain the fact that they went out of there rejoicing? How do you explain that?
Because they were being persecuted for Jesus' name.
Yeah, and found worthy because, wow, they think we're enough threat for doing that. We must be doing this stuff for Jesus, right? Okay, how do you explain this joyful confiscation of property? I'm trying to get at a minor point here, but don't be happy every time things go bad. This is being happy when things go bad because you are a Christian. Because you're doing what you should do, and your property's taken away from you because of the name. Great.
Which we're still so far away from anything like that here, it's very hard to find a good example.
Yeah.
Although, every time somebody talks bad about Christians in the church because of their experience, that's about the closest thing I can think of.
Oh my, yes, and
Persecution
there are
that-
times when Christians don't make the deal, they don't get the raise, they don't do things like that. Why? Because they're honest. They won't bend the truth. They won't sign something they shouldn't sign, things like that. So it's to a lesser degree, but you know, there may well be times like this.
Oh, I'm
There are,
betting on it.
you know, the thing that I know everything I've shared with you several times. Sorry about that. I keep repeating myself, but I'm just so overwhelmed that those who keep track of things like this said from the year 1900 to the year 2000, more people were persecuted for Christianity because they're Christian than for the first 1800 years of the church. You know, you think back in the first years and about how across the Roman Empire there were 10 great persecutions in the first 300 years of the church, and people lost their, yeah, that's true. But in the last 100 years, more people have been persecuted, more people have lost their lives than any other time in church history. We just don't see it here. But you know, there are places there are a lot of places
China.
in the world
China.
where, well, Yeah, I automatically go to North Korea. Think about
Yeah.
what happens to people who proclaim the name there. But he's saying, you accept this with joy. You knew, and here's the perspective. How could you do all that? How could you have this attitude? Because you knew there were better things waiting for you that will last forever. This is Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 3. Keep your mind fixed on heaven and things above. As you go through this life, you've got to constantly do that. Major theme. He's getting ready to introduce again. He's going to talk about our faith, and he's really going to paint this picture. One of the basic qualities of faith is keeping your eyes fixed on heaven, the city that God has made, right? Don't get so caught up in this world that you forget where you're going. Okay, so he says, you did that. He says, you remember back to those things. Verse 35, so do not throw away this confident trust in the Lord. Remember the great reward it brings you. Boy, I'll say that's an understatement. It's the only way you can get to be with God. It's based on what Jesus said. Think about the great reward it brings you. It brings you into the presence of God. It's the only thing that saves us. Patient endurance is what you need now. He's talking about an active endurance, not a passive one here. Patience endurance is what you need now, so that you will continue to do God's will. Then you will receive what is promised. What he's doing here in the last few verses, but especially verses 35 and 36, remember the scales of justice? Lady Justice holds the scales of, right? This is, you also find this in Romans, the 8th chapter. I love it. But the picture is, think of all the junk you face. Go ahead. Think of the worst possible things. You put it on one side, right here. And then you put what's going to happen the first trillion, billion years in heaven. And of course, that's just scratching the surface of what's coming, because we're talking about eternity. Do you get the picture here? I don't care what it is. Okay, I'm going to go to, I know I've shared this one before too, but as a kid, I can remember so clearly, there was this guy named Muhammad Ali, and there was a guy really like George Foreman. There's a couple of these guys, especially the George Foreman fights. It was the first time I remember as a kid hearing somebody making over $1 million in less than 5 minutes.
Whoa.
Oh my. In George Foreman's case, sometimes it was less than 10 seconds. Because many times, it was the first time he landed a glove on somebody.
Yeah.
They went down, he walked away, a couple $1 million richer. And my friends and I, we were all in junior high at this time, my friends and I are thinking, sign me up.
Yeah.
I'll go in there.